This is a screencast designed to help students studying the IGCSE course of the Cambridge Board, the CIE, in the group of poetry from Songs of Ourselves for 2015. The poem under discussion in this screencast is the poem Where I Come From by Elizabeth Brewster. Now, this poem is an interesting poem within this selection. There are links immediately visible, particularly to a different history, but also to the poem Continuum, and I hope that I will point those out as we go through. But let's just quickly go through this poem in the next 10 or 15 minutes to put into consideration some of the ideas I'd like you to be thinking about. So, the title itself, and I always maintain you should start with the title when you're looking at a poem, is highly personalised. The use of the first person clearly giving us a sense that this is a poem about Brewster's life and Brewster's perspective on life. There is, in terms of where I come from, a heritage suggested in the title alone, and this probably is the way that I would think of linking this with a different history. It's a very different form of poem, though, and also has a very different background. Brewster came from New Brunswick in Canada. Very remote, very harsh in the winter. Almost nothing there at all apart from trees. And Brewster's poem looks at the idea of character being formed by place, and the way that mankind, has reworked place and perhaps sought to tame nature whilst doing so. The poem itself is in 3 stanzas, and they have a specific role, if you like. In the first stanza, delivered in a quasi-omniscient third-person voice, we receive, if you like, the thesis that people are made of places. And this is discussed through the stanza, leading to the half line, crowded at rush hours, which introduces stanza 2, almost as if the poet has left the subway train in stanza 1 and moved seamlessly, same time, same place, as it were, into a different world. And that different world, of course, is the first-person response to stanza 1, based on the thoughts that the poet has about the country. Stanza 3, the couplet that finishes the poem, again seeks to sort of personalise this message. I'll talk later about the door in the mind and this metaphor that dominates the end of the poem. But one thing that is very clear is the message at the end of this poem is that nature, the natural untouched world, is not a romanticised place of rural idyll. It is a place of harshness, a place in which nature is cold and frosty. But it is, however, real and is not in any way manufactured. There are some interesting aspects of language as we read the poem, and I'll take them through in sort of stanza 1 and stanza 2, really. And we start with an opening statement, people are made of places, which brooks no argument. It is an absolute statement, essentially of fact, that sets out the central thesis of this poem. Brewster moves on in the next 2 lines to introduce a variety of exotic locations, the jungle, the sea, the ocean, before moving to the bulk of the stanza, looking at the city, this idea of people are made of the places they come from, the cities. And she begins to use more sensory imagery here. We're asked to consider the smell that we get, the smell of smog, of pure man-made fog, sharp and harsh, against the almost not smell, triple compound, of the tulips. And this sense of almost not smell opens up ideas. Are we talking of tulips that will smell but are not quite there? Are we talking of tulips that would smell, were it not for the pervading smell of the smog? Brewster isn't clear, but one thing that is, I think, certain out of this is that what there is an absence of, if you like, is the natural phenomenon of the scent of the flower or whatever it might be. She moves on, repeating this little phrase tidily plotted. To emphasize the taming of nature by man, we have this idea that man has plotted, has planned, but also has allocated into plots, into areas, elements of nature to be put in certain places in the city in certain ways, before the stanza ends with a triplet of negative senses in terms of the smells, that of the factories, the offices, and the smell of the subways when crowded at rush hour, this sense of the overpopulation of the city compared with nature, the location that she will move to at the start of the next stanza. In the next stanza, Brewster turns this experience of the city into her own world. There is a sense that there is a response to stanza 1 throughout this stanza. Compared with the city, the countryside is seen in a negative way. It is burned out. Farmhouses are old, in need of paint. Animals circle about almost aimlessly. And it's as though we're being shown the antithesis of city life. And we need to consider whether this is a positive or a negative idea that we are being shown. Certainly in stanza 1, the image of nature as tidily plotted is very important to get the sense of mankind taming nature to a new urban environment. Even water, the most free-flowing of all elements, has been channeled into a fountain in the centre. It's now simply a thing to look at, has no sense of freedom anymore. There's also no artistic freedom, we're asked to believe. No longer is art an element of inspiration, but now it too has been tidily plotted into a gallery with a guidebook. And I think we're asked to extend the metaphor of the guidebook to a wider idea of life in general, that everything that exists in nature can be organised into a guidebook in this way. Not only that, within the city, we're told that there is a smell of work. And again, this negative sensation seems to remove the idea of work from, if you like, a more physical sensation of the natural outdoor world that will be dealt with in stanza 2. Because in stanza 2, the idea is that the woods are in people's minds. And notice how along that first full line of stanza 2, Brewster splits the repetition of woods to either end of the line, almost as though trying to display in the language the vast expanse of nature. We also have to think that it's the vertical pine woods here that somehow are mimicking the close of the first stanza, the factories, the idea that in the city it may well be a conventional cityscape of tall buildings and towers and chimneys. In nature, these tall buildings are replaced by the pine woods. But there are significant differences here. Although much of nature is seen to be in a state of some decay, the natural world seems to be able to regenerate itself. Blueberry patches are found in the remnants of the forest fire. Not only that, but beauty crops up in the most unexpected places, randomly. In this case, the violets found behind the battered schoolhouses. Here there is no sense of a museum or a gallery to display what is beautiful. And it's a world of contrast. It's a world in which spring and winter are the mind's chief seasons. Now, if we assume that we're in a cyclical natural world, it's only mankind that has called these seasons spring and winter. But what they actually represent, of course, is birth and death, this endless cycle of life. This is what people have to worry about, not a museum guidebook, or whether the fountain is in the right place. Which brings us to the final couplet, which somehow seems to synthesize the poem into a straightforward outcome. Well, it's far from straightforward. I've said in the slide that it's tricky. And I think we see at a basic level that this final stanza is a comment about Brewster's heritage. This metaphorical door opens into her mind and brings in a reminder of life before the city. It's a life which is far from idyllic. It's a life which is harsh and unrelenting. And if we then take that back into the second stanza, it's interesting because the second stanza seems to present ideas of decay and destruction, fire, peeling paint, and so on. Are we being told that any attempt to romanticize this non-urban life into an urban setting is futile? Now that could convey an idea that despite the faults of the city is seen as somewhere better. But of course it also, and I think possibly more plausibly, suggests that any attempt to recreate the non-urban in the urban is essentially a flawed idea. The only memory that comes into Brewster's mind through the door as it blows open is harsh. It is a frosty wind, specifically frosty, not just difficult but cold and unpleasant. And fields of snow are all she sees. And snow, well, I think snow is illusory in terms of its beauty. Snow is a range of ideas, but amongst ideas in snow, rather than purity, it seems to me, is a sense of obliteration, a sense of covering. It's cold, it's harsh, and it whites out what was before. Of course, what Brewster doesn't go on to say, and what is linked with this rather cyclical sense of spring and winter, is that the snow will eventually melt, the ice will break, spring will arrive, and the cycle in nature will start again. The city does not have these cycles. The city is. The sense of the continuation that is natural can only be found in the non-urban environment. I hope you found this interesting and above all stimulating. I'm not in any way suggesting that it is the answer to this poem. But what I hope it does is give you a starting point and plenty of food for good argument in class. Thank you for listening.